All right, so I hope that all of the juicy tidbits from yesterday have officially sopped into your brain matter and integrated. If you're still processing, no worries. We'll spend the rest of the week really just driving these points home. And today we're going to talk about whether or not your doctor can tell you if you have parasites. This is what we think should happen, right? If I have an infection, my doctor should know it. This seems to be what medical school is for. Yes, this is how it's supposed to work. It would be so nice if it did work this way, but spoiler alert, it does not. And we're going to go over why that is today. So, the gold standard for parasite testing in the medical community is OVA stool tests. So, these tests have you collect a stool sample that is then sent off to the lab. A technician then examines the sample under the microscope using special stains that help to detect parasite presence visually. So it's best practice to provide 3 different stool samples from separate days to reduce the risk of missing parasites. However, as somebody who has tested twice in the medical community for parasites using this method, my doctor never had me do this. It was always just 1 sample. So this is really not standard practice, even though it should be. But even if you were to collect all 3 of these samples, it would still be very common for these labs to miss parasitic detection. So we're going to talk a lot more about that in just a minute. So there are also blood tests to consider. So while there are no blood tests that can test for all parasites, there are a few specific blood tests that look for certain types of parasites. So these tests look at your antibodies, and these measure the body's immune response to certain types of parasites to determine if they might be present. Then they also look for visible parasites. What we mean there is protozoans or microscopic parasites that tend to infect the red blood cell. So examples of these would be malaria or babesia. So lab technicians are looking at the blood under a microscope for visual inspection. Then beyond blood and OVA tests, there are also CAT and MRI imaging, which can sometimes be helpful for parasite detection. Very large worms can also sometimes be visible in the gut, but often these scans can help with detection in more of an indirect way by observing how the infection may be impacting body organs and tissues. So, for example, an enlarged looking liver or spleen could point to a plasmodium infection, but that would require your doctor to make some inference and make quite a few leaps in order to get that parsed out. So in all 3 of these blood, stool, and imaging test modalities, it's requiring a technician to use visual detection. So remember that, because we're going to come back to that when we're talking about testing gaps. So the last common method that we run into for testing for parasites are PCR and DNA testing. So basically, we use PCR methodology to compare blood and stool samples with a parasite DNA database. So you're basically matching the DNA in your stool to the DNA in this database to see if they line up, right? So this is very common actually in the functional medicine world with tests like the GI map. Maybe you've heard of that. But this method actually has a lot of limitations, as many parasites are not yet included in the database. And in addition, parasite DNA is known to degrade really quickly after the death of the organism. That has been documented in literature. So if it's coming out in the stool, it's likely dead. And if it's dead, its DNA is likely undetectable. So remember this, because we're going to come back to it in just a second. Now that we know what the most common testing methods are, let's talk about what the testing gaps are that we see in these options. All right, so just to piggyback off of the problems with that last method, the PCR technology, when it comes to parasite detection, I want to point out this recent paper from Nature Genetics, where they are comparing the genomics of the major parasitic worms. So this paper looked at the genomes of 81 species of roundworm and flatworm parasites, including 45 that had never been previously sequenced. So what did they find here? They found over 1 million new genes that had never been seen before. Entirely new gene families that had huge variation in their distribution. So first of all, the fact that we had 45 new species of worm, which comprised over half of the sample size, that had never been sequenced before, speaks to how small our existing parasite DNA dataset likely is. So if you remember from day one, I shared a paper that also shows that we are discovering more and more parasites every single year at a constant rate, right? So if we have no idea how many unknown parasites there still are out there, and we know that many of the unknown parasites have completely different genes than the ones we do know, how likely is it that you would be able to meaningfully detect your parasites using this PCR technology? And that's even if the DNA remains intact. Remember, there is literature showing that the DNA begins to degrade almost immediately after the parasite dies. So this is why when it comes to parasites, the GI map and other DNA-based tests are just not very helpful. So beyond just the PCR technology, other testing gaps include improper storage. So under most conditions, if a sample is not examined or put into a preservative within 30 to 60 minutes after passing, it's just not going to be accurate. This is what is shown in all of the literature, and so we have to take into account human error here. Next is insufficient availability. Often doctors, especially Western doctors who have not been trained on these topics, do not know the proper test to actually order, and insurance may even decide not to cover it if they do order it, or it might not be available because it's kind of a rarity in the developed world. All right, so then we also need to consider insufficient training. A growing shortage in the lab technician field has meant that many are not highly trained or experienced, and it often takes a trained eye to detect many types of parasites, which can be quite subtle to observe. It's also possible that parasites are not being expelled, right? So stools don't always reflect what's happening inside of the body. They're not always laying eggs and reproducing. And then, like we mentioned, we need to consider rapid DNA destruction. So many species of parasites have been documented to destroy their DNA when they die. This means that if someone has a particularly slow transit time, or if there are any delays in analyzing the sample, detection through DNA matching will be unsuccessful. And then we have shortage of time. So medical labs are becoming more and more rushed for time as they deal with many tests coming in. I'm sure many of you have observed this in your doctor's office. Errors may result in rushing through the process, which, as I've mentioned previously, does require a pretty deliberate and trained eye. One of the most obvious testing gaps to me as a biologist with a background in evolution is that we are selecting for stealth infections through our testing methods. In other words, if a species is living in the gut and passing eggs in the stool, it will be easily detectable and treatable. This means that this species will be far less likely to survive and proliferate in humans because we treat it and kill it, because we know it's there. But if you're dealing with a more systemic parasitic presence that doesn't necessarily pass eggs into the stool all the time, then it will likely go undetected and be much more likely to survive and be passed on to other people. So, one of the most common species where this can occur is strongyloides, which are little threadworms that often populate tissue systemically in the body and not just the gut. They can be in muscle, in the liver, in the lungs, everywhere pretty much. So, a stool test won't always be very useful. What's more, it will lead your doctor to erroneously conclude that you're parasite free, and the life cycle can then continue and spread throughout the community. So, these testing gaps create a cyclical kind of problem summarized in the 4-part cycle that we have here. The doctor first uses poor testing methods that can miss many kinds of infections. And then these poor testing methods rarely detect parasites, not because they're not there, but because of the poor test. And then this leads the doctor and testing companies to believe, well, there just must not be many parasites around. We've done a great job eradicating them. And this, in turn, means that no incentive is created to develop better testing methods. And so poor testing methods continue to be used, and this cycle is perpetuated. And then it does bear mentioning as well that the vast majority of antiparasitic drugs on the market are generic and are therefore dirt cheap. This sounds great for the consumer, but this also means that pharmaceutical companies and hospitals don't stand to make any money by prescribing and dispensing these drugs. So there's no impetus to look into this problem from a monetary perspective, right? So if they were to develop better testing to detect more parasites, it wouldn't translate to any more meaningful money for these companies. So it's much less likely to get attention. That probably sounds pretty cynical, and it's not the only thing at play here, certainly, but it is probably definitely playing a role. So, this brings us to the empowering part of today, which is figuring out how we should test. So, my favorite tool for testing for parasites is to look at blood work with a functional lens. So, if you have a recent blood work panel from the doctor's office, these 3 markers are often great indicators that there's a potential parasite presence. The first is high eosinophils on a complete blood count. Your eosinophils are types of white blood cells that often target parasites. So if they're increased, they're likely fighting a parasite. However, if you're dealing with something like asthma or histamine issues, this can also lead to elevated eosinophils. So you have to kind of factor in your health history and your symptoms here. Next is low iron and ferritin stores, especially chronically over time. So literature tells us that this is a well-documented anemia associated with chronic parasitic infection. And we know as well from literature that parasites can eat their weight in heavy metals. And so it's likely that that's one of the contributing factors to why iron and ferritin are unable to be in normal ranges because the parasites are eating them, basically. And then sometimes other white blood cell types can also be elevated if parasites are in play. So high monocytes and high basophils. Now, it's important to mention that you can still have parasites even if these markers are out of functional range. Signs and symptoms are the most important indicator to pay attention to, and more on that in just a second. Another great tool I like to use for more specific information about the species and strains you might be dealing with is a bioresonance test. I use Creating Balanced Health. So I say this, and many people think it sounds kind of woo-woo, but actually there's quite a bit of literature behind it. It's been shown to elicit improvements in fibromyalgia, in rheumatoid arthritis, in stomach pain, autoimmunity, and many other conditions. And then, like I mentioned, signs and symptoms should be your number one guide here. So I'm guessing you're here because you've already taken our free parasite quiz, but if you have not, I'll go ahead and link that below. So there are so many different ways that this problem can manifest because there are so many different types of parasites. And in turn, there are so many different tissues in the body that they can occupy. So when you think about it in those terms, it really makes sense that there is a wide range of symptoms that may be a direct result of having parasites. So, when we're thinking about this question, do you have a parasite? There's one super reliable test that you can do at home. Take your index and middle finger and put them up to your carotid artery on your neck and just listen. Do you have a pulse? If you have a pulse, you have a parasite. You can thank Dr. Todd Watts for this great joke. All I can say is that the truth is in the toilet. My clients have passed some incredible looking masses that sure look like textbook worms. And keep in mind that 90% of parasites are actually invisible to the naked eye. They're microscopic or protozoan. All the same, if you want to see some gnarly parasite pictures in my clients' toilets, keep watching because I'm going to show you some. But if you think that that sounds really gross, just feel free to stop the video now, okay? And I'll see you tomorrow. So, one last chance to hop off before we look at toilets. Okay, here we go. All right, so my client Chloe was just a few days into her first cleanse when she posted this picture and captioned it, "I passed a 3-foot rope today. I thought childbirth was the scariest thing I've ever done, but I don't know if I've ever been more freaked out. I can't believe that this was actually in my body. Yikes." And I will be real with you, it's sort of controversial that these rope-like structures, which we see a lot in parasite cleansing, are actually parasites. There's a school of thought that thinks that these might be biofilms that parasites are known to create around themselves. Regardless, people tend to feel much better once this stuff is out of them, and we see it a lot. These roundworms, or Ascaris lumbricoides, were passed by my client Lauren after 2 months of parasite cleansing. So, roundworms are some of the most common types that we see. And again, this is why it's so important to be consistent because before this point, she had not really experienced any changes. But we kept at it and she passed these guys and she began feeling a lot better at this point. So this was a 14-inch tapeworm that my client Donna saw sticking out of her stool during her first month of parasite cleansing. So she investigated and found this. So as you'll see, tapeworms are much flatter in appearance. They are sort of transparent looking, and then they have the suction-like head on the end. And then this is the last one, I promise. This is my client, Kevin, who is holding up what he called a 6-foot tapeworm-like thing that he passed about 1 month into parasite cleansing. And I think this is the longest one I have ever had a client pass. So kudos to Kevin. All right, so I just like to show these to emphasize that people who don't think they could be dealing with these things are often shocked to see what comes out in the toilet when they target parasites in a cleanse. So to me, that's the best evidence, right? And I'm also sort of the mind that even if none of this stuff showing up in these pictures, maybe none of them are parasites, which is hard to believe. I mean, if you buy a textbook with a picture of a tapeworm, it literally looks exactly like that. But let's say that they're not parasites. The important part is that everyone seems to feel better after they've passed them. So even if you don't believe, quote unquote, that these are parasites, just do a parasite cleanse anyway and feel better. And who cares what they really were, right? Okay, so that's all for today. Our takeaways are that existing parasite tests are primitive and extremely flawed. There are also systemic bias and human error factors that play major roles in the poor quality and lack of testing. And if you're unsure about your status, you can use your blood work, bioresonance testing, or your signs and symptoms to guide you on this. Alright, so in tomorrow's video, we're talking nutrition. How do parasites impact our nutrition? The correlation between nutrient deficiency and parasite presence. So I will see you then, my friends. Ta-ta.